Undoubtedly, you've heard of Top Gun by now, and if you tuned in for our last episode, you heard me speak with a real Top Gun pilot. Now, while I love the conversation, I have to be honest and tell you that my introduction to naval aviation was actually through their interbranch rival, if you will, the Blue Angels. The year before Top Gun came out, then Lieutenant Pat Walsh was selected as a member of the Blues, officially called the Navy Flight Demonstration Squadron. Due to strong family ties, I still remember everybody loading up and driving to Pensacola, Florida to watch Pat and team perform at their annual show over Pensacola Beach. I'll never forget watching them fly so close to the water. I mean, it looked like they could just reach down and touch the ocean. What a cool experience. A week later, I remember seeing on the news that the Blues had a mid-air collision, killing one member of the team. Join me as I sit down with retired 4-star Admiral Pat Walsh as we discuss both the beauties and the dangers of flying with the Blues, as well as a few other aspects of an unbelievably accomplished resume that is way too long to recite.
From Carry the Load, these are lessons from the front. Stories of service and sacrifice from our military, veterans, first responders, and their families.
Last week I had somebody in here who was a Top Gun pilot. If I'm not mistaken, you're familiar with that.
I could be, depends on who it was.
Well, the gentleman we had in here was Jeff Fellows, another Jesuit guy. But he also, like you, went to the academy. He played lacrosse at Jesuit, though, and I think when we were growing up, I hadn't even heard of that yet, and I'm guessing you probably hadn't either. But he ended up going to Top Gun and told us some really interesting stuff about that. But you took it a step further and were with the Blue Angels, which was I have to give you a lot of credit for inspiring me to join the military because I was exposed to that when I was in high school. How did you end up flying in the Blue Angels?
Well, first of all, for all my Top Gun bubbas out there, you're on the record now, on camera, as saying that the Blue Angels was a step further. So
okay, wait a minute.
I can't wait to get back to Pensacola.
You're going to have to educate me. Is Top Gun and the Blue Angels, are those seen as two different paths?
They are. They're two different paths. I mean, they involve excellence in aviation. One is in the discrete set of responsibilities associated with combat maneuvering and getting as a teacher, proficient enough yourself to be able to teach others in the air in three-dimensional space, what it takes in order to defeat another aircraft in flight. And that requires a lot of mental acuity as well as physical acuity in order to be able to stick with it. This is not something where you can take your eye off of things. You cannot relax. You have to be cold and calculating the entire set of maneuvers it takes in order to get the job done. For us, another level of concentration, but one real compliment to the team that most people don't see or realize is that when they look at the 6, 3 of those are brand new, have never done it before.
Interesting.
So every year there's turnover on the team. And the highest compliment you can give somebody on the team is, hey, that looks the same as last year. Knowing full well that's about 150 flights in the desert. El Centro is where we do our winter training. And we start out groups of 2 that are typically maybe 30 feet apart. The base altitude is 2,000 feet. So we'll say for purposes of looking at our instruments, 2,200 feet represents the deck. So we'll start maneuvers at 2,200 feet and finish maneuvers at 2,200 feet. If we make a mistake and we go lower than that, well, then, we critique ourselves. Every maneuver, every minute in the air is filmed. And so the flight itself can be 45 minutes to an hour. The debrief can be 3 hours or longer. So it takes that kind of chemistry on the team in order to make it work. And then typically when we go to a show site on a Thursday, we circle, we arrive, we pick up checkpoints, landmarks on the ground that tell us how far away from center point, which is the center of the show. So a mile and a half, 2 miles away tells us when we're down and set at altitude and we're on the same speed, whether or not we're going to pass in front of the crowd or way to the crowd left or to the crowd right. And so we'll work on the timing associated with that, as well as the closeness and the proximity of the maneuvers. After 150 flights, we're down to 150 feet. The diamonds work in 24 to 36 inches apart. And there's a lot of trust that comes with being on the team.
So I got to stop you there because I've actually had people tell me, oh, it just looks like they're that close. They're not really that close. 36 inches, wingspan to canopy. Or
I would go based on the sound of the boss's engine. Okay, so when it reached a certain pitch, whatever that is, that's 24 inches today.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So
if he didn't, so I'm pushing him with my airplane. Okay.
So well, hold on, we got to back up. We got to give everybody
are pushing. Yeah. Okay. So
boss is number one. He's the lead guy.
Yeah.
And so if
I'm on the left wing my first year, and then I'm in the slot for the next 2 years.
Okay, and the slot is and so when you guys are flying in full formation, you've got one in the front, you've got two on either side of him.
Yeah.
And then you've got three filling in the gaps in the wings in the third level.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were the left wing in year one. And the slot is
the guy that's got his nose between the second and the third aircraft.
Okay.
Number 2 and number 3.
Number 2 and number 3.
Okay. So he's right behind the boss.
So I just wanted to kind of mentally set that up for everybody as you're talking about this.
Yeah.
So you're going off the boss's, the engine. The sound of the engine is what I heard you say.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first year was an A4.
Mm-hmm.
And if he didn't push back, I could get him to make a complete circle. That's how close we are.
Really?
Yeah. So call that 24 inches. But so it's really important that 2 and 3, the left wingman and the right wingman, are balanced, because if we have different distances, then he's fighting one and not the other. In terms of that, I mean, that's how close we are.
So did you ever at any point think to yourself, what in the hell am I doing up here? Good. I mean, you look this way, you look that way, you look up, and you've got all this metal and potential destruction surrounding you with one false move.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of it as destruction. I'm thinking it's pretty cool. So I did see, my family had a reaction, when I got selected. But I ended up seeing my family more when I flew with the Blue Angels than when I lived at home.
I remember those days.
Yeah. Yeah. So they would show up. It was a good time for our family.
So getting back to it though, how did you get selected for the Blue Angels?
There's an application process that starts with a minimum amount of flight hours. 1,500 hours was the minimum. What that equated to was about 7 or 8 years of flying. What that meant in reality is that we had made deployment or deployments at sea. And the big differentiator for naval aviation is that time deployed at sea. So what that means is that no matter what, there's nowhere else to go. So whether the weather's good or the weather's bad, or there's been a casualty on the ship, or there's some mechanical problem, with your own jet, you have to figure out a way to manage all that, get back to the ship, and be able to go another day. So that sort of resilience in a deployed environment is really what gives people their reputations. And assuming that you can deploy in that kind of environment, then there's a certain chemistry of what it takes personality-wise in order to be able to be comfortable in that environment and work with the team. So as I described, the debrief can be very, very long. Well, the debrief means that someone is looking at you, Todd, and going, okay, as we advance the film, you're out of position here, you're out of position here. And, this is something we've been talking about for a long time, Todd. I don't know why you don't get this, but, fix it. You can get into those
I actually had those conversations with my dad a lot growing up.
So anyway, the debrief is where all the learning takes place. And that's where we either come out stronger as a team or we're falling apart. And in terms of just dynamics, a team that doesn't work well internally, it's only a matter of time before it plays out in front of a customer or in front of an audience.
So
I saw this in the business world.
Okay.
Yeah, this same dynamic. I mean,
But you know
first
what
of
we
all,
don't
there-
do in the business world is we don't debrief.
That was the point I was going to make.
Yeah.
So we're quick to move on to the next deadline, milestone, financial target, whatever it is, and yet we don't really understand like why we failed, or we superficially sort of gloss over it, and then
Because we don't
kinda
want to
do-
hurt anybody's feelings, and
or we don't want to really have complete responsibility, accountability, and authority. We only want that when it's convenient. But when we come up short, to understand why we came up short, to learn from it and move on. I mean, part of it is incentives. So where are the incentives in the business community to be able to do that? Because oftentimes what you've done is you've exposed a vulnerability or a weakness in the organization, and the temptation instead is that with that acknowledgement is to move that person along to someplace else.
so if I were to break your flights up, or your time in the Blue Angels. So let's just talk about the show day, if you will. And I don't know if that's what y'all called it, but that's what we'll call it for lack of a better term. You've got the time up to the actual show. You've got the show itself, and then you've got the debrief. And I would be willing to bet that if you polled a lot of people that didn't know anything about it and you said, what's the most important aspect if you break it up into those three groups? Most people are going to say the preparation, because that everyone feels that that's where you're going to make the most money, so to speak. I'm guessing you would probably say the debrief is the most important part, because that's where you're going to learn.
Because
the most.
that's where you can watch a chain of events starting to take place. It starts in the debrief, and the role of safety is to be able to recognize we're getting complacent. So we're compromising things that we shouldn't be compromising. And the good news about aviation is it's just hard facts.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean it's the ground. It's bumping airplanes. It's control of airspeed. I mean there's all kinds of different sort of mechanical pieces that contribute to an overall picture of whether or not this is a healthy organization. Same thing applies in business. So this critically important feature of team dynamics is woefully missing in the business community. And yet their employees are hungry for it. They don't want to fail. They don't want to see their company fail, and they can see where the issues are. And yet oftentimes they don't feel like they have a voice, or if they have a voice, they're not listened to.
So you use the term bumping airplanes. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring that up. You were involved, not you personally, but when you were on the Blues, y'all had an accident like that. You mentioned that in the debriefs, and I don't know if you were referencing this or not, but you talked about how you're getting complacent.
Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of tell everybody how that how did that whole thing happen? And was it ever addressed in the debrief in such a way where it could have been avoided or should have been avoided?
Yeah.
And I understand that you can't necessarily disclose everything, but
Well, the maneuver is called the Blivet. So the number 5 and 6 jet pass each other at low altitude and then roll inverted, push for an outside half Cuban 8, and then meet in the middle. There's smoke on the airplane. It actually inscribes the image of a heart.
mm-hmm.
In the Niagara Falls mishap in 1985, which is around July or so timeframe, the contract that we have with who is going to be straight and level and who is going to put the lateral distance, that contract was violated. So the 5 jet was the jet that sort of sets the maneuver, we would say. In other words, I'm going to be very predictable. I've got a certain airspeed, and I'm not going to move my wings, and I'm not going to react to you, and I'm going to let you get as close as you feel comfortable with me. So the 6 jet hit the 5 jet, clipped it, ended up in the loss of the number 6 pilot, and the number 5 pilot lost his aircraft but was able to eject safely and recovered on the ground. So the question about the debrief, yes, this is really where, you know, my experience has been watching the two of these two pilots work together, and yet over time, you know, the conversation is one where one pilot is encouraging another pilot to you know, to work closer to them, and I just don't think there was enough time and thought that went into changing someone's mindset that was comfortable doing a maneuver that, you know, John and Martha couldn't tell how far apart the airplanes were, to a point where we were compromising and not even recognizing it. You know, there's an element of complacency that creeps in. No one starts the day feeling complacent. You can see it in the way we drive sometimes. Mm-hmm. You know, we're just getting really comfortable with cars moving really fast and being really close to us.
That's a great point.
And yet you don't even know who's next door. You don't know who's in the other car. You make a lot of assumptions at night on a 2-lane road. You see a couple of headlights coming your way. You assume they're going to stay on their side of the road. Sometimes people get surprised, and there's no second chances with an accident like that.
That's a great analogy. I hadn't thought of it.
That's really where this is. I couldn't tell you what was in the mind of the 6th pilot, other than I had been around during the debriefs, where, you know, there was this strong commitment to being as professional as we could, to do the best that we could, and we stepped into an area where we got really complacent without recognizing the margin that we were the reaction time margin that we were cutting into.
So, what was the aftermath of that for you personally? How did that change you? How does that stay with you to this day, and how does it manifest itself?
Far more proactive when it comes to how we message the people who work for us. Far more mindful to recognize where people are comfortable, and I'm talking about, you know, this is high performance sort of comfortable. Mm-hmm. So getting people comfortable in a dynamic, high performance environment, and then helping them get to the next level of proficiency. That requires finding the way, the right sort of way and language, to sometimes have to repeat a message over and over, but to do it in a way that helps guide them rather than push them. So when people aren't comfortable with something, they'll have a way of expressing it, whether with verbal or nonverbal cues, and you can just tell. You know, as a leader, if you're connected to the audience, you have an understanding, and to pull on that in an environment where it's safe for them to express where they have reservations. That's hugely important, and it's something where the real value of what we do is that we can do it over and over and over again. But when we compromise and when we're complacent, then we lose that ability to be resilient, because we'll lose people, we'll lose aircraft, and, you know, everything.
I want to kind of transition a little bit to, okay, you had no combat experience up until the point that you were in the Blues. You leave the Blue Angels, and now you find yourself in a combat scenario. Mm-hmm. And that would be Desert Storm. How did that translate for you? Did it translate for you?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a critique that the Blues, you know, are entertainment, and that's all true. But there's a lot of advantages to having been on the team, and then be able to bring all that experience to the fleet. And what I mean by that is, you know, working in tough weather conditions, working in combat scenarios. I mean, there's an exactness about the way that we prepare for flight, especially in combat. In our training, we try and replicate a combat environment so that It's not that much of a transition. The ground underneath us changes, but essentially the way we go about it, the way we prepare, and the way we'll pull together a gaggle of airplanes, pretty much the same. So, to be a combat strike leader in Desert Storm, to me, that was kind of the epitome of what all of this is about. So going from the team to combat ops I was really grateful for that, because that's the whole purpose of why we had naval aviation. We had some tough days. We lost people while we were over there. I had a particular mission where, prior to the Blues, I had served at VX5, which is Operational Test and Evaluation out at China Lake. So it was weapons testing. One of the weapons that I was testing was a weapon I was going to use while I was in Desert Storm, and ultimately, because I had that set of experiences, I could manage the use of that weapon for the air wing, just because I had a different level of experience and different number of opportunities to work with both the strengths as well as the weaknesses associated with this electro-optic guided weapon. So on one particular mission, we were going after a oil refinery and trying to do it in a way that wasn't going to create an environmental catastrophe. So we had some very precise points that we were going after. I was going after the control building, and then maneuvered the weapon inside the window of the control building so that the controls would not be useful, but all the piping and all the plumbing was going to be available. That turned out
it was going to be available after the strike.
After the strike, yeah. In other words, keeping
that just doesn't even seem likely.
Yeah, storage. In other words, everything was held in storage,
right?
But in the ability to open storage and close storage, couldn't do that because the control valves were all shot.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I was able to verify that when I came back later.
That was going to be my follow-up.
Because my job in '91 was to destroy it, and my job in 2005 was to rebuild it. So
okay, hold
on.
When
the second, but because of my experience with this weapon system, we used some redundant loading.
Okay.
And so that worked. And then I got a call on a covered net to go chase a SAM.
On a covered net. Tell everybody what that
so that's an encrypted radio communication. It said, hey, there's an active surface-to-air missile site. So I dueled a SAM and went right down the snot locker at this guy. And, he'd taken out a couple of coalition airplanes. So we had a little beef with it. And I was able to launch this walleye and take out the Fansong radar, which is the radar that controls all the missiles. So rather than knocking out one missile, knock out the command and control, and then you've knocked out the whole site. So it was a good day at work.
So it was a good day at work. But did you ever stop and think about, because I think one of the big differences between pilots and those on the ground, it's your heart rate is up differently. It's more emotional. I mean, somebody is directly firing at you. And so it literally, in a situation like that, is kill or be killed. It's a little bit different mindset for you, although you did reference.
Well, remember, I mean, we're getting shot at.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, you did reference.
This is not some playground.
Surface-to-air missiles were flying.
Right. Well, I got an SA-3 over here. I'm going after an SA-2. And all the zoos, these are all the ZSU, AAA, which is coming up. And it looks like rope, especially at night, when it's coming up. So it's a threat environment. And, they'd love to bag an airplane.
So I guess where I would, of course, and that's you can see that.
Here's the difference.
Okay.
All right. So when you disengage and when you're back, you guys, what do you do? You go like in a tent, you go eat or something. I got to go back to ship and I got to get aboard the ship. I can't get to my peanut butter and jelly sandwich until I fly aboard the ship. And talk about heart rate. I mean, you can hear it from the Vietnam vets. It was going downtown Hanoi, that was tough. But going back to the ship, it's like, oh my God, now I got to go do this. And
You're talking about landing on the aircraft carrier.
yeah, and we look for bad weather to go fly into. I mean, that's just the way that's just the way it is.
That was certainly the belief.
Yeah, it feels that way.
So I guess what I was really driving at though is you talk to guys who have been in a firefight,
yeah,
and they talk about the heart rate being up, and that fear of the unknown for them sometimes creeps in, but they're reacting so much to their training.
Yeah.
Do you guys have the same level of training in the air that allows you to get that heart rate up to just be in a react to my training mode?
Yeah.
Especially in a combat situation.
So we intentionally try and set up training so it does just what you're describing. So whether we're at Fallon or we're on some other instrumented range where everybody can see, on the ground control, can see where the blue fighters are, where the red fighters are, and then have the surface to air activity that can also bring more realism in it. And then, have a real mission where you got to get ordnance on target or work in a contested environment. I mean, all of that is intended to create the environment and training that you're talking about.
So you talked about the fact that y'all did lose a couple of pilots in that engagement.
Yeah.
Any of them that you knew personally?
Yeah. Yeah, all of them, actually. So one in an A6 that was down low and hit by a shoulder fire at Sam. He was providing close air support. There was I think there was a C-130 that had gone down. There was a big aircraft that had gone down, and we were, sending people in to try and help with, a combat SAR, combat search and rescue,
right, extraction.
And then the guy who I flew with on this same flight, the next night he died. He was coming out of country and at 33,000 feet, and then ended up hitting the water at Mach. So we think he had a hypoxic event. It was really hard for his family, real hard for us.
A hypoxic event.
Yeah, so we're on oxygen when we're at altitude, and typically the cabin pressure is up to about 8,000 feet or so is ambient. So when you're in an airliner, you don't even think twice about it because you always have this feeling and circulation in the cabin of being on the ground. For us in military aircraft, that gradient changes at 8,000 feet, so that our cockpits are typically pressurized, but we always have oxygen. In this case, we think that there was a problem with the seal, and he was losing pressurization, which means that effectively his body was at 33,000 feet. So when you think about breathing in air from 33,000 feet, the whole chemistry is different, and the impact it has. It's much what we go through, and you'll see sometimes on video cabin pressurization drills among military pilots where they'll take off their masks and they'll breathe in air at 30,000 feet or so, and they go through hypoxia, and that's a lack of oxygen to the brain, and they typically lose judgment and then pass out and regain consciousness when actual airflow is restored. In this particular case, it wasn't enough time. I think he fell over and chest hit the stick and then hit the water at Mach.
You said that was particularly hard on his family.
Yeah, well,
like
we
more
knew
so
the family, a young daughter, young wife, and father had been a combat pilot and just had a hard time accepting that he lost his son in an operational loss rather than a combat loss. I mean, it's, for families in that kind of situation, they'll always be asking, always be probing, are you sure, there wasn't enemy activity? Scott Spiker had been shot down in that same sort of time frame. And people were wondering, what really happened to him. No one would actually acknowledge that we had lost a fighter to another fighter, to an Iraqi fighter at that time. So they thought it was a surface-to-air missile. There was some sort of explanation.
They wanted to believe that it was something more.
Nobody could have shot down a U.S. fighter was, what people were thinking. They weren't saying it that way, but that's what they were thinking.
So that was kind of the beginning of, you referenced what you destroyed in 91.
Yeah.
You were able to go back and rebuild in 05. So in between there was you and I were both actually stationed in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. If I remember correctly, you were at the Navy Annex.
It was underneath the flight path of American 77.
Do you recall that day pretty clearly?
Very clear. Bright day. I am monitoring a call for the Chief of Naval Personnel. I'm his executive assistant. His office is overlooking the Pentagon, which is actually the point of impact. And we hear the jet come over. The eyewitnesses say the wings cleared our building by about 40 feet. And people who were
40 feet.
40 feet. And the people who were on smoke break downstairs in the parking lot looked up and could see faces of passengers. Heard the engines come up, adding power, and 1 potato, 2 potato, boom. And, a couple of long seconds later, then alarms started going off. Used the ground line to call home, tell my wife I'm okay. She didn't know what I was talking about, had to hang up. And at that point, we were evacuating. We go out to Arlington National Cemetery because people were afraid of being in buildings at that point. While we're standing around the cemetery trying to understand what just happened, we hear another boom. It turns out to be a sonic boom as an F-16 is now racing to get to Flight 77, which they couldn't get to in time. But that comes across as a car bomb. People thought, oh, there's a car bomb. It's over at State Department. I mean, there were people were pretty beside themselves in terms of trying to understand what was going on. Incredible day.
It was. We had a guest on at one point who was actually in the building, same side that you were referencing. Danny Plumley.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I believe you know him, or
yeah.
He described it as, what he took away from that whole thing was the best of humanity and the worst of humanity, not just wrapped in one day, but really wrapped in one event.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've ever really talked to him about his story.
No.
But when I hear him tell his story, you tell your story, I've got my story.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the most, that was our Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And, we were all right there. And Danny was obviously a lot closer than any of us, but does that still stick with you?
It does. There's, as you unpack it, there's a range of emotions. To begin with, how did we not know? Because when you look at the steps that it took in order to bring something that size out of altitude and then line up with Columbia Pike to hit the building, that's a 4 or 5 minute turn in order to descend and get all 270 degrees around in order to be able to hit the building. And that can make the difference between life and death. So the impact point hits the DESPER. So that's the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel for the Army. Tim Maud's office, 3-star, who is the counterpart to Nora Bryan, who I was working for, who is the Chief of Naval Personnel. So it's my counterpart's office. His EA is running around trying to get people into a meeting they're late for the meeting because everybody's watching the World Trade Center. Tim Maud and the rest of the group are ready to start the meeting. EA is not there. At impact, everybody in that room dies. And the EA ends up outside the building, clawing his way back in because he had this really strong sense of loyalty to, his team and to his boss. One of the things that sticks with me, and it's in the category of best in humanity and worst of humanity, is the weeks that follow. The weeks that follow, Operation Phoenix is to bring the Pentagon back in 12 months. And it is incredible to watch the level of activity because, we would go in to work at, 5:45, 6 o'clock, and they were working round the clock. I saw workers, contract workers, running to the site to get to work. I mean, it's one of those things where that stays with me as well.
Running
with their lunch pails and their heavy jackets because the weather's miserable, and they're going to work. They're going to repair the building, and sure enough, 12 months later, it's back.
Just goes to show you what we can do when we set our mind to it.
Absolutely.
So, as your career progresses, you keep showing up for work every day. Weird, and you keep getting promoted. And next thing you know, you are the vice CNO. And so explain to people what that is to be the vice CNO of the Navy.
So that's the number 2 person in uniform.
Mm-hmm.
The position sits inside the authorities of organize, train, and equip. So each service has Title 10 authorities. And the vice chief of the services, we're all kind of the same, is really responsible for representing to Congress the overall health and welfare of the service. In other words, make the case for the budget and then explain the overall readiness of it. And during that period of time, there's a growing awareness that we have a real issue with mental health. And so part of the testimony that I made was on suicide and suicide rates. It was problematic for the Navy. It was really problematic for some of the other services. So typically for the Navy, we were finding statistically a couple of groups that were most vulnerable. And the 2 major issues were either relationships or punishment-related issues.
When you say punishment-related issues, you're talking about someone who was kind of in the category you referenced earlier where
they're in trouble.
They're in trouble.
Yeah, and so think about it. So this is 39% of the suicides that we would see annually would be traced back to either someone that's having problems with a relationship or someone that's in trouble.
39%?
39% on the people in trouble, 60% were relationships. So for the 39%, what that really means is think about the way we would deal with guys that got themselves into trouble. We tend to marginalize them. We don't tend to put our arm around them and go, we're going to work through this. We culturally needed to look at this differently than what we had in the past for people that were either the subject of an investigation or people that were about to be punished, because increasingly this group of people were taking their own lives rather than to go through whatever it was the process was taking them through.
It kind of defies the machismo, though, of the military.
It does. It's very different. I wouldn't have known to even say that had I not been digging in, looking for answers, because we were really perplexed that this was the final solution, that people would take their own lives.
Yeah, and I've made that reference before, and again, the book that I referenced earlier, I never understood that. It never even occurred to me, that could be an issue. But I've come, through the year, over the last few years, I've really come to understand how naive I was to it. What was it about? I mean, you're looking at this data and you're saying, oh my gosh, all these people, 39% are, involved. Or,
NJP, something
so
like
some
that.
kind of non-judicial punishment, and then the others. The relationship part I can understand a little bit more.
Yeah.
But
there's some more context to it, to the numbers. We didn't have a problem with folks on deployment. We had a problem when people came back from deployment.
They didn't have something to keep them busy.
Or someone to look out for them. In other words, the checks and balances that are in place for the deployment model are actually pretty good. And I don't discover all this until at the same period of time we're dealing with a number of individual augmentees. So the stress that Iraqi freedom and enduring freedom are placing on the all-volunteer force is that we're now gone through so many rotations of ground forces that the only alternative is to activate the Guard and the reserve. That requires a presidential order. That was done once, and there was no political appetite to do it again. So we had to augment the ground forces, and we would use sailors and airmen to do that. So you were talking about, the ground environment where people, had that heartbeat that was, beating so rapidly because they were face to face with the enemy. This was a different animal. This was IEDs. So this is the fear of the unknown that people would have. I mean, it got to the point where folks were having real issues in convoy duty.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I did as the vice chief is I realized what had happened as I go to deliver retirement remarks, and a family friend who's retiring as a Navy commander tells the audience that in a 48-hour period, he went from being mortared to being home. And it was like, oh my word. And in addition to that, he referred himself to Bethesda to get help and couldn't get through the system. I mean, this was the early days where we didn't really understand mental health the way we understand it today. So he'd get caught, on hold or voicemail or something. But, here's a guy that's saying, hey, I know things aren't right with me and I need to get some attention. And he's trying to get it and can't get it. So one of the things I would do was to go to, when I visited installations, I wanted all the individual augmentees, IAs, in one spot. I want to see them. I want to talk to them. I want to find out how they're doing. And typically in large organizations, there'd be 25, 30, 40, which is a pretty big number.
Sure.
And what kind of assumptions do we make about sailors doing that? The assumptions are that they'll come forward if they're having a problem and they'll let us know. In the meantime,
Which couldn't be further from the truth.
absolutely. In the meantime, they're just sort of ejected from their organization. They go serve for 12 months and they parachute back in. And if they don't say anything, then everybody assumes just kind of get back to normal. And so that's the root issue of how we started understanding we got a real problem here that we need to deal with.
So do you think the problems we're dealing with there and that have come to light in that regard, is that a new problem or we're just now aware of it?
Because of our deployment model, we had never experienced that before. As I was saying, the suicide issues that we ran into were not people who were deployed. It was a group of people that were 9 months, 10 months back from deployment, where they're living in an environment where there's shades of gray.
But we face those same problems historically. And I'm pressing you a little bit on this because, I know of family who took their own lives after World War II, after Vietnam. Certainly World War I, there was a lot of shell shock that translated to that.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds, what I'm hearing you say is that it sounds like that problem really snowballed because of our deployment. It's not that it wasn't always there. It's just the way we deployed. We were so busy over the last 20 years. It just snowballed in a way it never had before.
or we became aware of it. I mean, statistically, it would be interesting to compare numbers of what we know for mental health now versus in the wars that you described. I don't know. It would make sense that it's been a problem all along. It would make sense that people took their lives, but we didn't know it. It was described in other terms, or
Right.
it was statistically set aside so that we didn't have the complete story. In the technology world we live today, everybody's got a camera and everybody sort of knows what's going on, sort of. I mean, so I have a lot of faith in the data that we had. I couldn't tell you about, what we had before, but it was certainly clear that Congress wanted to be involved in any kind of solution, and they were anxious to have a program that they could put money against, but it just wasn't that kind of problem to solve. It wasn't one of those things that there were easy solutions. There were mental health solutions that required investment in mental health resources, which is a far more longer term kind of investment than just having a slide deck and a budget and assuming that was going to work. I mean, it's like the transition program coming out of the service. It's
Oh yeah, that one.
yeah. I mean, it's there
It's there and it checks a box,
in name only.
but it does not prepare people
Yeah.
for what they're about to embark on.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if you can be prepared for that. I think it's kind of like, it's almost like trying to prepare somebody going into boot camp.
So there's a lot of truth to that. And my suggestion would be to have all that 6 months after you get out, rather than 6 hours before you leave.
I would agree with that. I would agree because you don't know what you don't know yet.
Well, you would know what questions to ask.
Right.
And then you could absorb what resources are out there and have a better idea of kind of what to do with your questions and where to go.
But then that relies at that point, for the civilian world to be in sync with the,
Yeah, and it's not.
and it's not.
Yeah.
Well, I have one more question to ask you to wrap this up. Obviously, one of the most important things that we do as an organization, Carry the Load, is about restoring the true meaning of Memorial Day and doing Memorial Day better. And the best way that we can do that is by remembering those who made the ultimate sacrifice, which means with the uniform on. Is there anyone that you still carry regularly?
Well, Mike Rashan. So Mike Rashan's story actually sadly continues. So he perishes
And Mike Rashan was
in
the pilot.
1986, Blue Angel number 6. And he had a 5-week-old son, Mike Jr. Mike Jr. passes away at the age of 15 or 16 or so, Thanksgiving Day weekend. And so his mother, Sherry, now lives outside of Northwest Florida on a farm somewhere, taking care of rescue animals. But, it's a sign of the ripple effect that people have in the lives of others that you're not even thinking about or aware of. B.J. Dwyer was the pilot that we lost in Desert Storm. So he was on my wing when we went after the SA-2 site. He died the next night. And he had a young daughter as well, who's now a law school graduate. And there's unfortunately many more.
Well, I appreciate you sharing those with me. And Admiral Walsh.
Yeah.
You're Admiral Walsh.
What I used to be.
But you're still an admiral, but you'll always be Pat.
Sounds like tenure.
Yeah, it does. There's some tenure there. Thank you. I really do appreciate you making the time, and as always, I always walk away from a conversation with you learning something new, and I appreciate that. But I think more than anything, as I referenced earlier, the humility with which you approach everything.
No, thanks.
One of the reasons why humility to me is the most important thing that I look for in anybody that I do business with. And I have you to thank for that to a large degree.
Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing, Todd.
You bet. Thanks.